Okay, I think we are on the dot and we can start. Um, I am Veronica, otherwise known as V, whichever you want to call me, it's fine. I'm one of the chapter leads for OWASP Kristiansand. I'm also a project lead for the security benchmarking project that is now going to change to project observability. If you don't know about them, well, you'll find out about it a little bit later. And then over to my co-host.
Yeah, me, I'm Asbjørn Thorsen. I am in the arrangement committee in OWASP Oslo. So I'm really looking forward to see so many people in this first 2022 talk. We have set up a Slido. The link to the Slido, if you want to ask any questions to the presenters, it will be in the URL for this Slido will be in the meetup information. So we will watch the questions that comes in there. So I'll just we have had a change of plans. I'm sorry to inform you that Katie has lost her voice, and she doesn't feel good at all about that. But luckily we have Veronica that could actually just step in and bring this great talk to us. So yeah, maybe you, Veronica, can introduce yourself and just bring the talk on. Thank you.
That's cool. So thank you very much. I also just want to introduce my co-organizer, Kristiansand Emlen, the fearless leader of our department of DFIR at Norwich University College. But yeah, I'm Veronica. I am not Katie, unfortunately. However, I have a very colorful background. Feel free to go Google me. Don't be afraid of what you see there. Not all of it is as bad as it seems. I specialize in medical device forensics manufacturing and embedded security on software-related devices, specifically pacemakers and the likes. I presented at DEF CON about how I went about reverse engineering my pacemaker to actually bypass security. But I've been doing DFIR for close on 12 years. And one of the things that has always become apparent is that there is never enough information to deal with a breach or when a compromise has happened. So I kind of started a whole thing. If nothing goes right, then you push left. And that's the talk that I'm going to give you guys today. And this is literally been pulled together within 10 minutes. So forgive me if there's any gremlins that are here. I really was not prepared to be speaking this much today. But the talk centers around how do we build in forensic readiness, specifically in application security. So this is right at the beginning when we start planning. But who am I? I'm an assistant professor at the moment. I was a director for a DFIR company in South Africa. I'm about a year in Norway. I am a self-proclaimed cyborg, a goon for DEF CON, but more so a hacker, builder, protector, and forensicator. So I kind of cover all the spectrums. Now, this is kind of how I feel whenever I get called in for an incident. You know, it's the world is burning and I'm having a cup of coffee. There's never enough information or the wrong information or not anything that I can really use. Now, with that, I wanted to start really moving it towards actually influencing how data is built, how devices are manufactured, specifically in the medical and space of vehicles, planes, things that actually impact human life. Now, incident response is something that shockingly even developers do on a daily basis. And it's basically your field investigation. It's nothing new. It's just a different perspective on something that you're responsible for doing every day. Now, incident responders, as I know it, as security folks know it, are those that actually come in while the building's burning or a potential compromise has occurred. we get to look at your logs. Now, your logs are often either very good, very bad, or non-existent, or too much information. We absolutely love to go through this and find everything that we're not supposed to find. I always say that, your purple teamers are the magicians. We are expected to find findings out of nothing or produce evidence that doesn't exist. This kind of led me to, after 12 years of saying, I wish I had this in the logs, or I wish I had this in the system built in, to actually starting to build application logs better. Now, the relationship that development has with application logs, again, is very different towards the relationship that I have. Same terminology, different perspectives, right? As a developer, you want to know, well, can I debug my system if something is wrong? Can I find fault? Can I actually do proper error handling? But more so, can I measure the performance? Can I measure whether it's working as it should? Can you do different kinds of things? What platforms are they running on? Your user metrics. It's all about what you need to fix if it's broken. For us, it's a little bit different. For security folks, we want to know, is there an audit trail? One of the things that I found working with developers is that when I use the term audit trail, we all look back and we're waiting for the guy in the tie and the suit to come in, specifically a blue suit, for these little tick box exercises asking you if you have the following. Well, this is not quite what I mean. By auditability, what I mean is I want to see how the process is flowing through your logs. Who's logged on? When have they logged off? How is sessions managed? How is encryption done? It's more about an audit trail for us to know the who, what, when, where, and what. Kind of the cornerstones of incident response. More so, I want to be able to observe your workflow. I want to understand how your system is functioning, how it's processing data, how it's protecting information, and how it's transported. So again, a little bit differently than how developers look at their logs. I also want to know who accessed what, who your users are, what they've done, where the communication's coming from, and just so much more. Now, this means that we effectively on the same team, but we look at the same information with different perspectives, right? The logs haven't changed, the information within the logs have not changed, but how we interpret that information is vastly different. When the development teams are looking at it, they are looking at it for their purposes. But if I ask you the question, who designs logs? It's never the security folks, it's never the forensic folks. It is the development teams. What has become glaringly obvious during research into this area is that developers design logs for developers, right? For their purposes. Often security is something that is done at the end. Now, I'm probably going to upset half the room and some of you are going to leave. But we also refer to DevSecOps, which places security right in the middle. Or I've heard SecDevOps, which places security in the beginning. For me, security is a continuous process that just carries on. It's DevOps done right. There is supposed to be security in every component of software development, of building application and building devices. However, I do feel that prevention has kind of become this unattainable, impossible feat. We cannot simply build devices or software that is always going to prevent an attack. Everyone will find a way around it. But what we can build in is observability, detection, and recovery capabilities. And those kind of are core things that are found in logs. So can we detect faster so that we can respond faster and mitigate the damage that is done? So this is kind of what this whole talk is about, how logs can actually help you to become better at building. Okay. Now, I'm not a developer, big bombshell, not at all. If I build code, the world will explode. I will break the internet in two. I can read the code, I can review the code, and I can script to some way to get the information that I need. But this was simply not good enough. I needed to understand the world of software development because I wanted to understand how the device that is beating in my heart was functioning. So it started with a lot of research, and it started with the NIST security controls, which ironically is also what is used for the medical device. They try and translate these things over to devices that don't fit them. So if you look at these categories, these are security controls that we assume are in software or assume are in devices. Your log-ons, your log-offs, your audit controls, your authorization controls, system application, how your device is configured, de-identification. As some of you know, because you're part of OWASP, sensitive data disclosure is often a thing that occurs during the lifespan of a device. And these are always, almost always in the logs. As applications grow and you've done updates and you've had sprint cycles, you populate information into logs. However, if I had to ask you how many times after a major update have you gone back to actually see what data is still left behind in the logs, all of you might say that logs are only something we look at when there is a problem. It is not something that we measure from the beginning right through its development throughout the lifespan of our software. It also deals a little bit about backup and disaster recovery. If you've had a major ransomware attack that has hit your organization, are you able to recover fast? Is it going to take downtime that is costly for an organization? It also talks a little bit about data integrity, which is super important from a forensics perspective. When we want to look at your logs, we want to know that the integrity of the logs is protected. And then also how persons are authenticated. Now, that was only one, but then probably some of my favorite ones was the 20 critical controls. Now, the 20 critical controls don't mention a lot about specifically logs, but it does say that you should collect, manage, and analyze audit logs to help understand how to detect and recover from an attack. What was important from this for me was the fact that detection is highlighted. Again, all organizations focus on the prevention of a breach, but that is perfection. That doesn't mean that we no longer do security. Security should be done as a standard process. It's not an additional thing we should be doing. It is things we should be considering. But detection is something that is often a byproduct of code that has been written. We assume that the logs will populate the data as we build the code. But what has become very important in the teams that I've worked with is that we actually take what we want the logs to be and build those capabilities in the design phase. That means the code that is written with a purpose to populate specific detection capabilities within the logs, effectively building in what we refer to as forensic readiness, or as you refer to it, observability. Now, the ASVS, and I know Toby's gonna grimmage here, also makes mention of a lot of things around logging, specifically how we do error handling, logging and auditing and architectural requirements around it. One of the things that came out that was highlighted here is there should be a common logging format or approach that is used across the system. Now, if we are in a software development world or in a big organization that develops multiple devices, like a medical device manufacturer, you might be very shocked when you start reviewing the logs that they're all in different formats. They're all very siloed and operating in singularity versus actually working together, which means to build a SIEM or a SOC is a feat that is impossible due to the nature of the data differing. So the ASVS, that sentence there shows that there should be a common logging format. There should be a common logging standard. And this is kind of where the OWASP secure logging benchmark comes in. It sets a common language, it sets a common structure, And it also sets principles towards what you should and shouldn't log. You should also always verify how your logs have been transported. A lot of these logs exist on what I refer to as hostile devices, devices that end users use. They are then sent back to the organization, and often integrity checks are not done. We check the integrity of the outside, but the data inside is never validated. And these are some of the things that should be done. So if you accept logs from an outside device, outside your control, checking and the integrity of the data is super important. Now, the ASVS has lots to say around logging and monitoring, and it talks about one of the primary objectives is error handling in logs. We want to know that there's errors that have occurred, right? But we also want to know that there's security incidents that's taken place. Now, how do you know that a security incident has taken place? Well, you take what your baseline is. In SANS, they have a saying, know your normal to know your abnormal. Much like you understand the workflow of your application, you will understand what is outside the norms of that application's behavior. Okay, so what are some of the things that the ASVS says we shouldn't do? Well, collecting sensitive information. Now, often this is done by accident, not by malice, but accident, where a printf statement has been inserted into somewhere during debugging and made its way into production. Sensitive data should be dealt with accordingly. And a little bit later in the talk, I'll show you some techniques that are employed by Apple to do exactly that. You should ensure that the logs that, the information that you actually collect, is properly classified. The privacy levels should be set according to the data that you collect. Some systems are allowed to collect PII, some are allowed to collect PHI, some are not allowed to collect that at all. And often these things are found in print bodies within logs. If your logs contain sensitive data, you need to at least encode or protect those things in production. Now, if you haven't read these books, I would recommend you purchase them now. These are two amazing books that have probably set me on my way for my work with my PhD. These books are the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project, and it kind of paints the picture between ops and development, and just the dysfunctionality that there is. But this kind of laid the groundwork for what me understanding more about logs. Now it talks about 5 philosophies according to the book. And these are very simple philosophies that we can use every day in our work. Locality, simplicity, focus, flow, and joy, improvement of daily work, psychological safety, and customer focus. Now, in an incident, when something has occurred, we do what is referred to as root cause analysis. And psychological safety is one of the foundational things we use, where we're able to discuss what we've done wrong and how we can make it better. I took these 5 philosophies and I turned them into 5 standard philosophies for logging better in application security. They also set me on the path of wanting to build better logs. Okay? Logs are not simply just an output in the console that tells you that your code is functioning correctly. They need to have a purpose and a meaning. Now, I've been told that this is a pipe dream, but a year down the line, we've seen great success with lots of organizations actually improving their logs. So let me share with you my 5 philosophies for bettering your logs. You should keep it very simple, structured, and detailed enough. Often the information that you have in your logs are unstructured data that needs to be additionally parsed. There's really no meaning to having convoluted print bodies that don't tell us what has happened. Often when we come in and try and parse that information and build custom tools to, read the information, there is data loss that occurs. As an organization, straight at this beginning, you need to set a standard of what the output is going to be for your logs. What is the structure going to be? What is the common language going to be? Keeping it simple also stops you from having information that could potentially be to your detriment and cause an incident to happen. You need to consider, are your logs just going to be something that you pull up when something's gone wrong, or are you actually going to be effective in ingesting these into a SIM solution or SIEM, depending on how you call it, and actually build metrics around your security posture, be able to detect an event that has happened, or even just something that is giving you an idea that someone is probing in your systems. You need to understand what the purpose of the event is that you are going to be monitoring. Is this solely a debugging event? Is it an error that's occurred? Is it something that's got to do with security? Or is there something that could potentially be used for future forensic incidents? Or do you want to measure performance? You need to understand what the event is for to effectively write for them. The last thing you want to do is be in a world of pain. We're in an infinite cycle of passing logs that are unstructured, ugly, and unreadable. Now, philosophy 2 is keeping it tagged, create metadata, and use. Now, if you're in forensics, we love metadata. It's where we're either going to find what you're hiding or where we find the truth. Now, developers need to consider that the data that you deal with have got sensitive elements. It might be credit card numbers, might be health data. It might be confidential information that you don't want to have up. Well, there are ways specifically that you can tag that and have that data appropriately dealt with within your logs. More often than not, when I have done an incident response and I've gone through the application logs, I find app keys and secrets that have contributed to the incident or the compromise occurring. Organizations should be very aware of the data that they retain in their logs, because potentially that is low-hanging fruit. Now, if you're an Apple or fangirl or fanboy, you'll know how Apple does their logging. Apple has a way where they actually are able to set the privacy level for a specific data variable and deal with it accordingly in the logs. For example, you might not want to have debug level events and information that you need to fix something in an information level event. So again, this helps teams think ahead of how to actually protect the data that is sensitive from leaking into your logs. I always say, assume the information that is contained within your logs to be public information, specifically if it's stored on a phone unencrypted and you have no control over that external device. Now, philosophy 3 is keep it clean and focused. And it talks about the dreaded legacy debt that we don't want to talk about when we've inherited applications. Much as you deal with technical debt, you also deal with logging debt. With every update, every change, every sprint you've gone through, or any code you've introduced, you potentially have added to your logs. Logs just have a way of growing over time into a beast of sensitive data disclosure that no one wants to deal with. Now, how we have gotten around this is actually generating a sprint cleanup, where every 2 weeks, one thing is cleaned within the logs. One item on the backlog is specifically focused around log hygiene. This also means that in a short amount of time, you will start seeing differences. The one team dedicated one item on the backlog every 2 weeks to cleaning their logs, and they had lots of noise. Within a year, they reduced the redundant information by 40%. Just by actively, constantly dealing with information that has been left within the logs. The key to being able to do early detection is having information that's usable and not noisy. Okay. Logging, and this can be done with the benchmark. Now, if you want access to the benchmark, I will give you a link to the project, but what the benchmark does, it measures where your logs are It measures where you want to go with your logs and how you can improve to get there. These tests can form part of your testing processes that can be right in the beginning, can be in the middle, or it can be at the end. But it is something that should be actively done. Philosophy 4 is the most unpopular and hated one, and it's the one that I love the most. It says, assume at some point you will suffer a compromise, so log accordingly. This is something that security teams often consider. However, developers don't consider this, but that is not at their fault or anyone's fault, but it is. We don't want to know that what we've built can be compromised, but inevitably at some point it will happen. So build in the information that will be needed to do root cause analysis. I always say be kind to your future incident responder. If you've read any of the clean code books by Uncle Bob, he says be kind to your future self because you will need to write your code. Well, the same can be said about logs. Code produces logs. Therefore, if you are not kind to your future self and write good code, you're unkind to your incident responder in the future that has to come try and figure out what your logs say. So build the logs with actionable information that can be used to identify vulnerabilities. Now, how do you know what is vulnerable in your system? Well, of course, you use OWASP Cornucopia for one. That is a good way to threat model. The best hackers or pen testers for an application is the ones that have built it. There are sessions that you can run to identify a potential vulnerable area. If that vulnerable area potentially cannot be fixed, log around it, have monitored events that tell you that something's gone wrong or that something's been exploited. So again, know what's normal in your environment, know what's abnormal. Now, philosophy 5 is consider who has access to your logs, how they are stored and how they are transported, right? Ultimately, in my mind, no device, no system, or no method of transmission can be fully trusted. Okay? In multiple breaches, there has been information that's been gotten from the logs. In forensics, we talk about the Lateral principle where two things come into contact, there is trace evidence. Well, this is the same when logs are transported. You have to verify again what is in your logs. As I said, consider them public data. It certainly is not the if you're going to get hacked or compromised, it's the way. Now, sensitive data disclosure has been part of OWASP's top 10 for a while now. 34% of data breaches in 2018 involved an insider threat or potential information that was leaked, right? Malware ransomware happens on a very frequent basis. Cybercrime with COVID has increased by 600%, but on average, it still takes us 228 days to detect a breach has occurred. Now, I started the secure logging benchmark, which is nothing more than a fancy spreadsheet at the moment, where it's taken into consideration many terms of regulatory compliance, best practices around logging, monitoring, sensitive data disclosure, incident response, funneled it down to the most important events you should have in your application logs to be forensically ready. What you can do is there's three different approaches. Right at the beginning, when you are designing, you can actually go through and measure what kinds of events you want to build in. What is the minimum maturity rating you want to have as an organization for the logs to be ingestible? You can go in with legacy logs and determine where they are and where the deficiencies are. This forces the analysis of logs. Now, generally, if you go ask the one person that is responsible for field investigations, he is the one that knows the logs the best. I can guarantee you not everyone on your team knows the logs at that level. Now, once you've scored your legacy logs, it gives you an idea of where you get to go. And once you've done improvements, you can again measure where they're at and whether you've actually improved. The categories in the secure benchmark actually tells you where you're leaning as a team. Are your logs specifically built for debugging, so for development purposes? Are they built for performance metrics, or are you actually measuring any security related things? Now, again, logs are made for developers by developers, and often you'll see that the metric is skewed. You don't have a very good balance of where the log should be. For me, a big thing is if you know what is broken, you can effectively fix it. Something that's broken is not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. Neither is being hacked. It happens to everyone. We just don't want to talk about it. But how you fix it, how you approach it is really what makes the big difference. So how do you deal with these things? You take the big chunk of the problem, your big log state, and you start breaking it down. You make it a game. You gamify it. What we did with the big medical manufacturers actually broken it down in sprints and made it a CTF challenge. You find something that is horrible in your logs, you place an item on the backlog and you fix it. And at the end of that year, whoever had the most Easter eggs, as we call, fixed, received a prize. Again, everyone can be bought with hoodies. Let me just put it out there. It's a simple fix, but it motivates teams to actually do better. We ended up finding sensitive data that was fixed. We found app keys and secrets. We found JWT tokens. We found HTTP headers. We even found credit card information between the 3 teams that I work with. This means these things have been in the logs in production without anyone knowing it. Thankfully, not being exploited yet. But again, your logs are either your friend or your foe. Depending what they contain, depends on where they are placed. Now, just the short and sweet, like me, your log should always be simple. They should always be structured. It should be a common language. Have just enough information, not too much. Prevent sensitive data disclosure. This is often where people get breached. Now, obviously, this is not the total talk, but this is what I could come up with in a short amount of time. If there's any questions, I'd really love some input from you guys. And if you need help with logs, always just reach out.
Well, thank you, Veronica. Quite impressive to do this at the last minute. It's a great talk. Do we have any questions? We don't have any in Slido.
I'm going to take that as a good thing. Or Toby, you want to quote the bear. You always love having discussions.
It's fun to hear somebody infiltrating development. Coming from inside the house myself, you know, you're complaining about the lack of, you know, consistency across development teams, and they're all doing their own thing, and it's just obviously resonating a lot with me. You know, developers are about as cooperative as cats, right? I've always said the collective noun for developers is an argument, right? And you know, so I'm thoroughly impressed that you're just rolling up your sleeves and just trying to get somewhere, you know, with them. Have you given any thought to perhaps templating for popular logging frameworks? We don't mention the most popular logging framework anymore.
No, we're not going to poke at Log4j, please. That's caused enough headaches. What the aim of the project is going to be is actually to develop. We have a survey that's going out once we've got ethics clearance, that we're actually hoping to find out what is the most popular frameworks that are being used, and then creating templates for those, as well as a common language framework. But there is a whole host of things that go with it. But the most important thing is basically teaching developers forensic readiness, teaching developers security. to be quite honest with you, it's the big change in making things more secure. It doesn't lie in the hands of forensic agents or security. And I know this is a very unpopular opinion that I have, but I also think first responding to an incident lies in the DevOps team. You build it, you own it, you run it, you investigate it is kind of my motto in life. Therefore, giving them the tools to be able to do this and look at information from varied perspectives, I think always creates like a super team.
Yeah,
Because,
I absolutely agree. I've had some very awkward conversations with SOC people myself, and I think honestly, if it's framed correctly, as like you say, that super team, there's complementary skill sets there, and you know, I think anybody in a SOC team will be the first to admit they don't have the context. Right, they're not at the level, they're not at the application level, they're not at the system level, so they don't have the context, which slows down that response and reduces that understanding. The application team's much closer to the problem. They do have the context, but they don't have the broader view. So the combination of the two, absolutely, is always going to be, you know, greater than the sum of its parts. I agree.
yeah, I think I remember an incident that I responded to was at a big bank. Their application was breached, and you know, coming from another town, it quite significantly slowed it down. And as I was saying to the SOC team, well, I need the following application logs. I got told, well, we'll have to contact the developers. We don't know where they're stored. And it became quite apparent that working with the development team, I got to, you know, the information that was needed much faster. If I say to them, I need you to preserve the evidence with a, you know, with a hash value and you have it in a protected format that it doesn't get altered, they were able to do that quite easily because it's not things that are foreign to them. But they also knew that if we took a system down, that there would be an integral part of, you know, the architecture that fails in the end because, you know, the one can't without the other. And often this has been a frustration for me being an IR is my hands are tied because I don't have access to external, you know, to clients' services. But training teams as first responders, by the time I got there, the evidence was prepared and all I had to do was root cause analysis. I see we have a question here. What do you do when devs don't want to use tools you suggest to them for security? Well, I think Toby will tell you what my technique is, but that's often not the best technique.
There's only so many kneecaps available to you to break.
A funny story, Toby was creating the Copy app, and he was threatened with kneecapping if it was not working, but that is not the way that you should operate. Effectively, how I got teams to do what I needed them to do was having them believe that that is what needed to be done, was finding one developer that you could inspire, train, and teach to push from the bottom up. Going to the product owner didn't yield much from the top down, but actually working with the developers and, you know, showing them that they can broaden their horizons saw, you know, happening much easier. But again, for me, I am very much tool agnostic. I don't like to push tools as much as I like to push, I want to say common sense, common security sense, because I think, you know, once you understand the fundamentals and the foundational information, you can apply it to any tool. Is there anything published yet for this project? Even if it's yes, the stuff is on OWASP. It is being updated this weekend. The spreadsheet will be made available as well as all the company information. This is kind of like didn't have a choice but to go ta-da because we lost our speaker. So please forgive me that the stuff hasn't been updated on the project, but you can go read about a lot of the things that are on there. And if you want to participate, please reach out. We're always looking for new people to test the benchmark. Okay, Toby, are you?
Sorry, we had a comment a little bit further back about the Elasticsearch reference. What's that one? Doesn't seem to define a visibility or privacy field of some kind.
So what I meant with, I think, tagging your variables is this is something that's done in code. So that information never actually makes it into the logs. For example, if you have a patient identifier, its privacy level could be set to PII, which means that it's salted and hashed, or it's redacted, or it's not even in the logs. The reason that we want developers to tag the variables is that they can set the controls of what goes into the logs and what doesn't go into the logs. I hope that answers the question. Okay, I think I'm going to introduce Toby now. Toby is a very good friend of mine. He is the CEO for Secure Delivery. I have no idea what his talk is about. It's the most confusing abstract I've seen in my life. It's something to do with measuring. It's something to do with lateral flow tests. For more than that, I do not know. And Toby, do not disappoint me. You know what happened. And with that, the table is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share a screen as well then. At which point Zoom has this wonderful habit of just changing the window arrangement completely and moving everything around. There you all are. I see a lot of faces on top. If anybody else is comfortable showing their face on the video, I do love to see faces. It makes, it's lovely to all be together in a room with pizza and beer and just like the old days, but we can't have that at the moment, unfortunately. But it is lovely to see your faces. It makes the dynamic for the speaker much more familiar. So hello everybody, thank you for inviting me along to this today. Today I'm going to be talking about mistakes metrics and lateral flow tests because, well, COVID, got to work it in somewhere. There's nothing else to talk about at the moment. V has, I'll get kneecapped. V has introduced me, but I've obviously got a slide with my very big silly bearded face on it. So just to give you a bit more context about who I am and possibly why I'm here today. As V said, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Secure Delivery. Soundbite, we help organizations adopt modern security practices. That's what we do through various means. As you can probably tell from the beard, I've very long history in software engineering. I've built a lot of things. I've done a lot of things in my time, specifically working within regulated organizations and establishing secure engineering functions. Introducing the concept of doing clever things with computers to security teams is kind of my jam. Security teams, particularly for large organizations, tend not to really, let's say, amplify themselves and their capabilities through automation and doing clever things with computers. So it's a big lever that we can use to help scale security across large organizations. So as part of that work, I am the original author of HSBC's Secure Development Handbook. This is, as it says here, the field guide, if you will, for what to do, what not to do, where everything is internally at HSBC, which is a very large organization of 30,000 software developers, and they operate in 68 countries, which is 68 banking regulators, which, as you can understand, is an absolute goddamn nightmare. I had the foresight to build that as a Git book and make that collaborative, and I did hear start of 2021 last year that I am no longer the main contributor. That's now been adopted by the engineering community, and they have run with it, which is fantastic news. Copy has been mentioned earlier. So if you're familiar with OWASP Cornucopia, it's an OWASP project which gamifies a bit of agile threat modeling. It's really good fun for teams and really damn useful for bottoming out potential security issues and getting them captured in the backlog. If you'd like to know more about that, my co-founder and OWASP board member Grant Ongers is giving a talk on it at the OWASP, some OWASP chapter in the Netherlands next week. I apologize, I've forgotten, where he'll be working through Cornucopia and the online digital version at Copy as well. It's free to use. You're more than welcome to go and use it right now if you want. Don't let me stop you. Speaking of OWASP, I am also the project lead on the Open AppSec curriculum. So this sits under the purview of the Education Committee, and it will derive and define what matters and what needs to be taught from an application security point of view, both across academia and in industry as well. Now, if you're interested in education, if you're interested in teaching, and you'd like to get involved, please do reach out. We're looking for people this year. We've got some really big things coming around potentially OWASP's very first certification track for application security engineer, which is a whole new world for OWASP. We haven't been in certification before, and we are working with a corporate sponsor potentially to actually put that in place. So really, really exciting times. If you're interested in that kind of thing, this is a great time to get involved. Okay, sales pitch over. Let's launch into it. Now, I feel a bit bad opening with this slide. I'm going to give people nightmares. And this, this is a big question. This is the big question, and a very hard question to answer for most organizations. There are lots of factors involved, and the world outside of your control, whatever organization you're working within, changes constantly. So the requirements for secure enough change constantly too. Now, you could reframe this question to ground it more in reality, which now starts to acknowledge the limits you have, both commercially and pragmatically. And it also acknowledges that this is a process where an end goal is never necessarily reached, because things internally and externally change so much all of the time. Or, of course, you can knock the question straight back to whoever's asking and ask them, how secure do our systems need to be? And of course, you'll get the answer, I don't know, you tell me. And all of these questions have something in common, and it's that to answer them acceptably, you need to have objective measures. You need to move security out of the theater and into reality. That's what people are looking for from us. So today we're going to take a thrilling look at metrics. We'll start with what makes a good metric. Then we'll go on a little adventure through the kinds of things that organizations are typically measuring for security. And finally, we'll dig into what we mean by security and hopefully get some data-driven insight into what underpins and affects the security of applications. And hopefully that will give us or help lead us towards the objective measures that we are looking for. So let's start with what makes a good metric. There's various lists, but I like this one. This is one that I like. Pull this one together, the things that I believe matter. And a good metric is owned by a clearly defined group. Who is the metric measuring, and do they know that the metric is measuring them, quite importantly. When you have clear ownership, then the metric can be actionable, and a good metric has to be actionable. Is the group being measured able to take action to improve things? And do they know what actions to take to influence that metric? And in influencing the metric, is that process isolated to factors controlled by the group it's measuring? If the metric is influenced substantially by factors outside of their control, then again, it's not a good metric. It's not isolated enough. A good metric is timely, and there's two aspects to this. Firstly, there are leading indicators, I'll go on this side, and trailing indicators. And trailing indicators can confirm long-term trends, but they can't predict anything. And metrics are meant to be predictive and ahead of the bad things happening. So leading indicators make for good metrics. And that's what partially what I mean by timely. Secondly, does it change frequently enough for people to correct it before it's too late? And that's very, very important, obviously. To give you a bad example of this, measuring customer churn and people leaving and abandoning you will tell you once your customers have already left. But measuring customer complaints will tell you before they go. So one of these is a trailing indicator that something bad is going to happen, and one of them is a leading indicator, and far more useful to you. A good metric is also correlated. Is the thing you're measuring even correlated to the thing you want to improve on? Now, this might sound silly and hard to do, but confounding variables can always get you. If you measure employee productivity as revenue generated divided by number of employees and track that over time, if you don't adjust for inflation, then year on year, you're probably measuring inflation. Congratulations. And finally, the most important criterion by far, a good metric is behavior changing. We ultimately want our metrics to influence people and change things for the better. If a metric doesn't do that, it's a bad metric. We do have to be mindful of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. You know, we don't want people to be incentivized to gain the metric. So while we want to be behavior changing, we don't want to cause bad behaviors. We want to cause the good behaviors. Now, with these in mind, let's take a look at the most common metrics for security out there in real life. And I'm glad I've made this as image heavy as I have after Veronica's talk with all of her memes. I don't want it to be too dry. And I know you are in awe at my photoshopping skills on this one. I made this. Now you might chuckle at this one, but frankly, it's the reality for lots and lots of organizations that aren't actively addressing and measuring security. It's a completely reactive state to be in. And it's often adopted by default by organizations, particularly ones that haven't had anything bad happen to them yet, most probably by sheer luck. And if you aren't measuring anything objectively, then by default, this is the situation you're in. And you don't know whether that number is reassuringly or ominously, if you're the token expert in this disaster movie, you don't know whether that number is reassuringly going up every day because of how great everyone is and how secure you are, or if it's because no one has cared to notice how insecure you are yet. So let's give this pretty crappy metric a score based on our rubric for good metrics. Terrible across the board. It's not good. It's not clear who owns this as a metric. Security, operations, development, everyone, whole org. And if ownership isn't clear, then it's definitely not actionable. It's definitely not timely. It will come after the fact. A security incident is always a trailing indicator of something, or probably a lot of some things that have happened before. It's not well correlated because there are massive amounts of confounding variables outside of your control here. And it's very, very hard for this metric to influence behavior because you have no idea what behaviors in your organization could be helping this metric to go up by one day, every day, over time. You have no clear cause and effect. We pray to the sun god every morning before dawn, and the sun always comes up. Great! Until you get that rare event and the sun is eclipsed. And now clearly the gods are displeased. What were you doing wrong? How can we regain the gods' favor? Well, I mean, now you've got to sacrifice a CISO to appease the gods, right? And probably put in a lot of additional processes and controls and compliance and governance so nobody can ever make things insecure ever again. And oops, now nothing gets done or delivered for years. So beyond here, and we all would like to be beyond this, but we do see this happen over and over again, the big overreaction to a security incident, because nobody was really keeping control of anything, and then all kinds of random acts of business violence happen afterwards. So as an organization, you're going to get a bit more proactive about security than that, and you're going to get some security testing done. Now, how does that look for metrics? Do we have any pen testers here tonight? Anyone? Hello, Peter. I'm hoping you're going to agree with me here, but if I cause offense, I do apologize. I'm hoping you agree that you are not a good metric.
Yes, I think that actually, if a pen test succeeds, then it's cool, but there is probably a ton of things that actually are never discovered, and pen test is some kind of a thing that gives reason for actually doing some things, but it's not a measure of security.
Absolutely. So great. I'm not going to offend Peter. And we're talking about tracking security over time. So let's take a look at manual security testing. A lot of firms will, when they get concerned about security, attempt to do a periodic external security test, probably annually. So what does that look like? The metric would be, did a fairly bored person, sorry, Peter, at their regular job at work, because it's your job, for whichever security consultancy we engaged, successfully break into a version of our application, one version, in a test environment using widely available tools in the 10 days we paid them for back in November 2020. Now, it's terribly unfair. Let's look at that from the point of view of our rubric, because again, a lot of companies, this is as far as they are going. It is owned that this happened, that there's some results from the pen test. If you want to get binary about it, pen test succeeded, pen test failed. Good, bad, grades in between. It's probably owned by the development team who built the system being tested. That's good. The problem here is that it's a single team owning it, and you might have hundreds or thousands of them in your organization. Some companies do have thousands of them, as you've seen. It's theoretically actionable by that team. Whether anything will get fixed or not is very dependent on the culture and behavior of the wider organization, though. So not very isolated to that team, which isn't hugely influencing. It's far from timely. Every pen tester I know, whether they're working externally for companies, contracted in, or whether they're internal pen testers, they all want to be doing it more frequently, much more frequently for longer periods of time, and they're unable to. So an annual pen test is far from timely. And of course, you can see here, our last one was in November 2020. We should have had one in November 2021, but the team was too busy. So it got pushed back to Q1 this year. And now we're in budgeting for 2022. Once that's done, we'll look to book something in for later in the year. Right? We've all seen this can be kicked down the road as well. Now, I've talked about very large organizations. Large banks often have a policy for annual pen tests for critical assets. But large organizations like the big global banks will have 800 of these, or 1,000. Let's call it 800, because I know that for a fact. You cannot organize 800 pen tests a year, no matter how much money you have. It's next to impossible. It's also a trailing indicator of a year or more's worth of development and behavior. It's kind of correlated to the security of the system, Sure, in a test environment that doesn't look much like production, and only historically at some point in the past. But again, there are many confounding variables around this, around how successful a real attacker would be in production, trying to cause mischief. I can't say it's particularly behavior changing. The team responsible for the system might fix things, but it's not going to affect the behavior of everybody in the organization. And can it be gamed? Sure. Just find an important enough person to sign off on accepting the risks that Peter has found, and you're good to go. Okay, so enough of the negativity, but I did definitely want to highlight the general state of affairs for most organizations. What should we be measuring to meaningfully influence the security of our systems for the better? Well, let's start with what we mean by security, and specifically for this group, application security. That's why we're here. So another big question, what is application security? If we're going to think about it, if we're going to reason about it, we're going to have to define it. And I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, and I'm going to define it. We could define it in other ways, but I like this one. Application security is an intrinsic quality of the software systems you're building and of the processes used to deliver them. When we ask, is that system secure, and take actions to determine whether it is or not, we are revealing that security is an intrinsic quality. It's something it either has or it doesn't have, to a greater or lesser degree. And your systems can be secure as designed and built, but there are many ways that how you're building them can screw you over, frankly, from a security point of view. And this audience will be familiar with a lot of these. You know, somebody on the team could push production passwords or API keys to a public repo, boom, credential breach. A very sketchy person could approach one of the developers on your team at a large financial institution and offer them an eye-watering amount of money to put a backdoor in. A couple of Bitcoins will turn anybody's head nowadays. Yeah, maybe 3 or 4 nowadays. It's going down. You could have a supply chain attack. Sorry to dredge up recent bad memories. An open source library that a lot of people use could get some nasty code introduced into it. It gets pulled in by the next build of a system, and bam, you're compromised. And many, many other ways that how you're working, how the team's working, how the system's being designed and built can also cause security problems. So we're talking about the security of supply chains and what they produce. We're talking about the security of our own design and manufacturing process. There's a whole lot of materials and activities that have to be of an appropriate quality to ensure the end result is secure. Garbage in, garbage out, right? We don't want that. So hopefully that's pretty clear, but security as an intrinsic quality of our systems does sound a bit philosophical. So let's define that too. Now, this is the ISO 25010 system and software quality model. And I'm going to ask the question I always ask, has anybody seen this before? V has. Now, this is weird. Nobody's seen this, but it's really damnably useful. And it's a standard. And it covers the functional aspects of quality and all of the non-functional aspects of system and software quality. It's a great model. It helps us reason about things here. And I've put a blue box around security, helpfully, so that you can see where that is. You're welcome. Now, one of the things the ISO team have done here, checking the time, one of the things the ISO team have done here is they haven't put this model together as a pure isolated thing. These qualities, they've connected to how the system provides value to a business. So there is a left to right order, which way around do you see me? Left to right order of importance, if you will, or steadily decreasing business value, if you'd like to think about it like that. So take a look at that. Left to right. Left, highest business value, right, lowest business value. See if you've got any problems with that. I like it. I think that's absolutely spot on, but person by person, industry by industry, you may disagree. And you might think that, say, reliability is more important than performance, say. But a system with 5 nines availability that's always up, but is really, really slow and practically unusable by your customers is obviously completely useless. And security is somewhere on the border between the non-functionals that people care about, the top of the pack there, and the non-functionals that people don't much care about. I'd like to put a little overlay on this just to help showcase the obvious. Everything on this side of security is mainly things that people can see and touch and interact with. And from security down, it's the invisible non-functionals. Security, maintainability, portability. Typically, the impact here is possibly just on the team building it. They'll feel the pain of maintainability problems or portability problems. And the same with security until something bad happens. And, if you were to consider a team pushing a change into production for a live system, for a big popular system that had an immediate adverse impact on performance, the impact on the business would be huge. Performance would be immediately apparently dropped off a cliff, customers would start leaving, revenues would go down, it would be a disaster. But if that same team pushed a change into production which had a huge adverse effect on security, what's the impact to the business? Nothing. No impact whatsoever in the immediate term. And something bad might never happen, but hope is not a strategy, right? So despite it being effectively invisible until something bad happens, and despite it being far down on the scale of business value, the prospect of the acute, painful event happening for an organization means that we need to address this. We need to address all of these adequately. So a system's security is just one aspect of its overall quality. And as we saw earlier, if something terrible happens, what it's showing us is that we weren't paying enough attention to these non-functionals. And there's quite a lot of interplay between them as well. A reliable system will have good logging and monitoring, and V will be happy. The reason it's reliable is because it's very, very observable. And of course, if it's very, very observable and transparent to the team that build and operate it, then it's likely more secure as well. It's probably more performant. So there's a lot of interaction between them all as well. And as I said earlier, a security incident is a trailing indicator of something. And in this case, now we've seen what security is. A security incident is a trailing indicator of low product quality, low system quality. And again, trailing indicators confirm these long-term trends, but they don't predict them. So to get ahead of security incidents, we need to know what causes the vulnerabilities that attackers take advantage of. What are the causes of crime? We need to focus our efforts there. Tough on vulnerabilities, tough on the causes of vulnerabilities. So what causes security vulnerabilities? Well, we've got some really good data here as well. It's developers. Turns out, developers cause software vulnerabilities. So this is from a NIST study of the root cause of all CVEs reported in the 8 years from 2008 to 2016. It's a wonderful little study. It's a 2-page paper from NIST that you can find online. I've got a little citation down there. I love a citation. An analysis of vulnerability trends by NIST came out in 2016. And they established from a root cause analysis of a lot of CVEs over those 8 years that in only 14% of cases, the root cause was a fundamental design flaw in the product or system, whatever. And then in even fewer cases, slightly fewer cases, only 13% of cases, it's a misconfiguration of some description that can be done. It's part of how the the product or system can be configured or is configured out of the box, perhaps. But then in 73% of the cases in these 8 years of CVEs, the root cause of the vulnerability was an implementation defect, a programming error, a bug. And this hopefully makes sense. There are only so many ways to screw up a design: boxes and arrows, data flows. Sorry to trivialize. There's only so many ways you can screw up a configuration, although of course we've seen configuration languages and files balloon out of all proportion for complexity and approach the complexity of programming languages. But programming languages are very complex. It's an extremely complex human endeavor, and we are very poorly equipped to do it properly and to do it well. So we get it wrong a lot. And for this group here tonight at the OWASP meetup, I'm sure you'll be aware that vulnerabilities at application code level tend to be really, really nasty. They'll punch straight through any other security measures you have in place, any other controls, and tend to give attackers a direct route in and out without anybody noticing. Or Peter, a direct route in and out without anybody noticing. He's depending on these. He's depending on your bad coding. And historically, in the cybersecurity world, traditionally, the focus has been very squarely here. We've done a lot of design reviews. We do threat modeling. We do hardening of configurations and take an awful lot of time and attention in these two areas, and not so much on the big part here, which has stayed quite squarely with the development teams. It's not often the security team delve into the code. Certainly, very, very rarely are they going to fix anything in the code. You don't own it. So most of application security lies in preventing security defects in code from reaching production and fixing the ones that are already there. It doesn't mean we can ignore everything else, but certainly it's essential we have a measure of security defects in the code as our best metric for how secure our systems are, because it's the massively biggest contributor to the security of our systems. It's clear and understandable, and it's a good leading indicator if we catch it early enough. And the DevSecOps people in the room now getting very excited. I'm going to do a very quick overview. I think I've got time. Am I right for time? Yeah. I'm going to do a very quick overview of the types of security testing tools that will give you a measure of security defects in code. A lot of you here tonight, I'm sure, will be very, very familiar with all of these tools, but please bear with me. Once I've established the basics, I'll get onto some benchmarks of how they all perform, which will hopefully be some interesting data for everyone. But just to make sure everybody's up to the same level in understanding, I've emboldened some of the tools that we typically use at various stages here. I'm sure people have seen the shift left, the left to right view of delivery here. I've resisted bending it into the infinite loop of delivery. I'll leave that to Glenn. Getting down into security defects in code, we have static application security testing, we have SAST tools. I'm going to cover dynamic application security testing just quickly as we go through, although it won't actually delve into the code. It's interesting to understand it as a complementary tool. Interactive application security testing and MAST, mobile application security testing as well. So all tools that sit around kind of design and code time and at build and test time as well. So pretty early on. So you're probably familiar with, oh, by the way, if any of these chat questions are coming in, or I'm not really looking at the chat at the moment, if they're important and about what I'm talking about, if somebody can interrupt me, that would be lovely. And then I can just address the question. But if it can wait till the end, then.
Oops, you say that I'm going to do it. There's a question. Would you consider an OGNL struts bug a design bug or an implementation bug?
Sorry, say that one again. Would I consider what?
Oh God, I'm speaking English. Would you consider an OGNL struts bug, a design bug, or an implementation bug? Don't ask me. I'm reading it, so you can go read it as well. I don't know.
It's a wonderful question, Erland. I'm going to have to say I'm not entirely sure what an OGNL struts bug is. Unfortunately, can you give me any more information? Is this closer to configuration than code?
The issue with OGNL is it's a language that you can use to like interpolate strings and interpolate things, and then you accidentally end up with basically double evaluating stuff, and then you can run code because yeah, things happen. So I'm just asking because like
no, I understand.
Designing code is designing code is not necessarily like a clear path in between.
Yeah, absolutely. There are many levels of design, and you can take you can push that design right down to where typically architects love to stratify themselves, and at the very bottom you've got software architects who will get like right into the details of how the functions are composed and how the modules hang together. So you can push design all the way down, and in fact code is your lowest level design document. So it's so low level, it's able to be actually interpreted by a computer and turned into machine code. But it is your final and lowest level design document ultimately. So I don't want to get philosophical about it, but yeah, it's kind of design all the way down. And I've got to say, I'm not entirely sure where the NIST folk drew the line on that analysis. Probably quite high level. And I suspect a bug here would be filed and categorized as an implementation bug, just because it's right down there. Obviously, there's some very low level design choices being made by those implementing it, but I think it's pretty close to the metal. Any more? No. Okay. So. SAS tools, static analysis. I say it's looking at your code, and again, this is kind of your lowest level design document. So it's pretty much just an automated code review. They're all kind of a compiler. Some of them are pretty much just collections of regexes, which is fine. They're very quick to run, and they can pick up on an awful lot of problems. But some of them actually want to analyze data flows through, so they'll do some compilation into an in-memory object graph and then query that object graph as well. So they're all kind of a compiler, but a very permissive one. They all will pretty much accept whatever crap you feed them and attempt to give you some kind of usable response. Unlike a typical real programming language compiler, which if you have a syntax error, it will just blow up and tell you to go off and fix your shit. So they're very, very permissive compilers, and they're multi-language as well. So any SAS tool will deal with all of the mainstream languages. So what that means is somebody's had to build a multiple language compiler that's very, very permissive with very, very few resources. Building a compiler, commercial compiler, is an intensely complex engineering endeavor that takes a lot of money and a lot of time. And while our favorite large SAS tool vendors are certainly funded to the tune of billions, they're not going to build fantastic compilers, and they don't have to. So these compilers are very, very, very slow. They're not the best engineering in the world. The worst I've ever seen was a full scan of a very large banking Java application, which took 5 days to complete. It was about 12 million lines of code. So performance of these things tends to fall off a cliff on large code bases, and that cliff is at around 100,000 lines of code, really, and then woof, it really starts to plummet. So they're not particularly great from an immediate point of view. They're best used kind of out of band rather than as part of your quick turnaround build and test continuous integration. And once you do get into them, you're going to start discovering just how many millions of lines of code you've got floating around. The dynamic application security testing, of which an example is an OWASP project called ZAP, which you may be familiar with. This is, rather than looking at code, black box testing over the network, automated pen test, very, very dumb one, but potentially very, very useful. You can think of them as kind of a fuzzer. If you're familiar with fuzzers, they tend to just throw all kinds of nasty crap over the network at endpoints and attempt to break them and cause some unanticipated behavior. Again, pretty slow. They're running over the network, they're spidering, they're generating a lot of requests against endpoints, and it takes them quite a long time. So again, out of band, overnight, weekend runs, that kind of thing. Quite hard to configure these things, but once they're configured and into orchestration, they can quite happily tick away eternally. On the mobile side of things, we've got MAST, which is effectively DAST for mobile apps. You send your built mobile app to the MAST service, and they'll stand it up on a big device farm and kick the crap out of it for you and give you a report. The issue with these is typically the test suite that informs the MAST service as to how the user flow and where everything is in your application, you have to keep it up to date with the vendor, and it will probably be a proprietary test language there as well. So they can be a bit of a pain in the bum. Interactive application security testing is relatively new, come out in the last kind of 5 or 6 years and popularized in the last 5 or 6 years. This is an agent-based security testing tool, sits inside your running applications, inside your APIs, inside your web apps, and instruments it automatically. So it can see every executed code pass, every data flow, which means they tend to run in real time. They're not slow in any way. A big downside for agent-based things is that they can't see any code that you don't light up at test time. So if it's dark, it's dark. If you don't exercise it, it never sees it. And of course, being agent-based, you need a Java agent for your Java apps, you need the .NET agent for your .NET apps, so they're very language specific, whereas a DAST tool doesn't care if you've written your APIs in Haskell, which you might, it'll just test them, whereas you'll be very hard pressed to find an IAST tool for Haskell. Currently, we've only got commercial products available for IAST, and as you'll see on the benchmarks, there's a reason they're quite expensive. So let's get to the fun part. Now, there's a fabulous OWASP project called the OWASP Benchmark Project, which is a terrible code base, deliberately, by design. It's really bad Java code, and we know where all the defects are in it. So we can benchmark tools against it and see if they detect all of the bad things in that code base. And crucially, see if they detect things that aren't there at all. And we know they're not there. So we know when they're going off with false positives as well. And you might recognize this true positives against false positives as, if you're statistically inclined, as a Uden's statistic or a Uden's index. It's commonly used to determine the effectiveness of medical tests, where you want good sensitivity to detect positive cases, and you want very, very high specificity so that you're not getting false positives out as well. In case you were wondering when Toby was going to get around to talking about lateral flow tests, it's now. Now, lateral flow tests have very high specificity. If you test positive at home with a lateral flow test, there's an over 99% chance that it's correct. If it tells you you've got COVID, you've almost definitely got it. So lateral flow tests show a very low amount of false positives. 1 in 1,000. They're about 99.9% correct in those cases. So if it goes off, stay home. However, depending on many factors, including your viral load and various other ways and how well you perform the test yourself, they do show a wide range of sensitivity that only averages to around 58%. So almost half the time, if you do have COVID, particularly if you're asymptomatic with it, a lateral flow test will miss it and tell you you're negative. And that puts a lateral flow test here on this chart. So far left, which is brilliant, very, very few false positives, but only just above midway on detecting actual cases. Now, PCR tests, again, have a very high specificity, trouble with that word, of around 99.9%. So again, absolutely slammed over. Whoa, jumped ahead. Spoilers. Absolutely slammed over on the far left of the chart. But they have a much increased sensitivity of between 85 and 98%, which averages out to about 92. So this is why the guidance up until fairly recently has been that if you are symptomatic, don't do a lateral flow test, do a PCR test. We don't want to leave it to a 50-50 chance if you're not feeling well. We'd like to determine really yes or no quite accurately. So that's why the guidance will tell you that if you are feeling crap, don't bother with the lateral flow test, go for the PCR test. Much, much higher sensitivity. So from the security testing tools, where do they sit on the chart? We'd like to see things up in the top left. We wouldn't like to see anything below the red line. Anything below the red line is worse than guessing. Toss a coin per line of code, right? Save your money. So you want to see everything above the red line, and we want to see things grouping up into the top left. Now, I'm hoping it's not too small. I'm sorry the text is a bit small on that one, but I can't give you actual tool names. There's a blend of commercial tools and FOSS tools in here, and a lot of vendors would never talk to me again. But I can show you where the groupings are by type of tools. And I find this very, very informative. And in a big broad swathe across the middle, now we'll point out everything's above the red line. Yay. They're all better than guessing. We have this big swathe of static analysis in the middle. And I apologize to the colorblind in the group. I wasn't thinking of you when I did this, but the big oval in the middle there, the blue one, is all static analysis tools. And they vary wildly. But something to call out is, M and V points on this chart. These and D and E, they're detecting almost 100% of the defects in the OWASP benchmark repo. And that's wonderful, great detection. But as you can see, they're all sitting about 50% false positives. So there's quite a bit of noise coming out here. Now, if you've confused the static analysis tool, it's possible the static analysis tool is easily confused, but it's equally as possible that your code is very confusing. So this might be the tool, this might be you. All right, let's not judge too harshly here. But clearly it's a bit of a dark art divining where the defects are just by looking at the code, because it's written by humans. It's very messy. Down in the bottom left, we have this little zone of DAST. So all of the DAST tools tend to cluster in very tightly in the same area here, where none of them reporting false positives. If a DAST tool has discovered an issue over the network with your system, you have an issue. However, because they're on the outside looking in, they're only detecting about 20% of the defects that we know are there and are serious problems and are exploitable problems. And up in the top left, we have the glorious golden zone of IAST, and you can see why they're expensive. 100% detection practically and 0% false positives. The IAST tools, if you can use them, if they support your languages and frameworks, and you can get them in there, they will give you, and you have the test coverage, of course, they will give you fantastically accurate results very, very quickly. If this inspires anybody to start a new OWASP project, to build an IAST tool, I'd be very happy. The whole world would be very happy. We would love you. But again, because there's only commercial ones available, that's telling you kind of the same thing about as compilers. It's probably quite an engineering effort. To build all of these IAST tools. So hopefully this has been some pretty interesting information. And you can do this yourself. You can run the OWASP benchmark against any tools. We're going to be pushing at Secure Delivery to kind of update this with some of the latest tools fairly soon. We don't tend to publish this hugely widely, even though it's anonymized. But I just thought it'd be quite interesting for this group tonight. So how does our code security defect count stand up as a metric for tracking security? We've seen how much it contributes to the security of the system, so we know we're very, very correlated here. And it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty good against our rubric. You know, we've figured out that what we need is high security quality in our systems. And we've used data to show that programming defects are the biggest contributor to low security quality. Not the only one, for sure, but a major one. So we can pretty confidently state that we want as few code level security defects as possible, always. So the metric is definitely owned. The code under test is owned by a known group. And if it's not, then you've got bigger problems as an organization to deal with, because you've got completely ownershipless code. It's very actionable, down to a very, very fine-grained bit of detail. All of these tools will give you all the information you need to triage and go in and fix these defects. And you know, the team that owns the code is able to address those defects, so they can influence the metric in a very isolated way, and everything's under their control as well. It's very timely. This metric can update as frequently as the code does, and it gives us a good leading indicator of any problems well before they manifest as security breaches. It's extremely correlated to security, as we've seen. You know, the raw numbers that are coming out of these tools for counts may not be entirely accurate. As you saw from the benchmark, you might have false positives, but the process of triaging that output and dealing with any of the noise is a pretty useful learning exercise for teams as well, I've got to say. And the metric is behavior changing. If everyone can see the state of the code in everyone else's repos at your organization, then we almost always see improvement over time. We're competitive. We don't like to be the worst in any given situation. So this metric allows security teams to prioritize their time where it's most needed too. Yeah, so we're starting to crack open this black box, and we're starting to show where we've got the worst code bases, where we've got the best code bases. So a security team for an organization is always going to be very resource constrained. Anything that gives them some guidance as to where they're most needed is very, very important. Now, can it be gamed? Can you game this benchmark? You absolutely can. All of the tools allow you to go in and mark findings as not a problem. False positives, nah, mate. So a bad actor in the system can very quickly clear out hundreds of defects and get them off the metric. But a good complementary metric to this is percentage of defects marked as false positives. And again, that allows a security team to prioritize their attention and go and have a quiet word with whoever thought it was a good idea, just to sweepingly mark everything as not a problem. And I've done that before. It's good fun. So this is a good start on that journey, if you're not quantifying security yet, on that journey from just reacting to breaches, crossing your fingers and hoping, through annual external manual testing. This would probably be my recommendation for your first real metric around here. This will give you some fantastic insight. But of course, things are more complicated than just this. So just to close off tonight, the real world is a little messier. You know, teams could want to reduce their security defect count, but lack the understanding. They could have the understanding, but depending on the culture of the organization, they simply are never given the time to fix these issues. They'll just remain as issues in a backlog. And, you know, influencing and changing behavior at scale globally for large organizations to achieve your non-functional requirements like high availability or great security, it does require a whole org commitment. It doesn't take too many bad actors in positions of power within organizations to ruin pretty much everything here. So if you're familiar with SRE that came out of Google, you'll see effectively that approach at global scale for achieving non-functional requirement around availability. And there's nothing stopping us from applying the same principles to security, as long as we can get objective measures that can be committed to, that we can measure accurately, and that we can improve on over time. So they're all solvable problems, varying levels of challenge. And that's where I'd like to leave it today. There's a lot more to this, but if anybody wants any homework, I did mention earlier that how we're building systems has a pretty big impact on their security. So perhaps have a think about what would be good metrics with this rubric to measure the quality of the delivery processes as well. So thank you very much, everybody. A bit of a whistle-stop tour through through the world of measuring security, but I hope that was useful. Thank you. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Toby. Appreciate that. It was a very good talk.
Oh, well,
All your
thank you.
talks are good. I have one complaint. I don't think you've got enough memes in there.
I don't
feel
even.
like-
I've got an XKCD. Come on.
I mean, I just like reckon you really disappointed me there, but it's okay. Your kneecaps can survive one way.
So I don't know if anybody's got any more, if we've even got time, if people need to go.
There is no questions that I can see. I see there is a question that I missed about the logs, about whether or not I prefer JSON logs to pure text, and I'm going to say structured JSON wins every time. It's super easy to actually structure your logs using a JSON output, and lots of CM solutions actually take that in. And hopefully Toby and I will have a workshop specifically dealing with some IR issues at OWASP, if it's accepted.
That's the plan.
But yeah,
What a
thank
team.
you.
What a team.
But thank you very much to Oslo chapter for having us. We really had fun joining you all. Yeah, looking forward to more events and hopefully one day in-person events.
Thank you, everybody. It's been very.
And
Toby,
I hope the GraphQL topic will come up also in future, because especially from, let's say, the testing side, this is one very interesting part. I've been looking for information about this side, and also hacking other let's say also no SQL things, and so on, and the scarcity of the information is deafening. So
Agreed. I'd very much like to see that.
Yeah, I just sent her a mail, and she's eager to give us this talk, but
Yeah.
to do that, she must have her voice.
yeah. To tell her we are very much hoping to meet.
I will.
I've had a question from my friend Sam come in, which is a very good question about measuring security defect density rather than total count. And Sam, I was going to cover this explicitly in the deck. So I decided it was just a little bit too much information, but now you've asked the question, I'm going to get on my soapbox about this one. And my issue here is, you know, every security defect in code is a potential exploitable vulnerability, every single one. The fact that you have got 5 million lines of code in total instead of 1 million lines of code in total doesn't change the fact that you've got 200 high severity bugs, security bugs in your code. Doesn't change it. You have the same amount of risk. The size of the code base doesn't actually mitigate any risk at all. So I avoid density completely. You don't want to reward Java developers for writing more lines of code, right? Please stop. So I would always stick to count. I do give a lot of thought to ratios and densities, and you'll see a lot of people talk about how you can use ratios and metrics to make them more comparable over different time periods and things. But for security defect count, I would always go for absolute count. 200 critical defects is 200 critical defects, no matter what.
Thanks, Toby. And actually, I have another question for you, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
You mentioned two things, right? So security defect count as a metric, but the second one you mentioned is the percentage of false positives, right? Which is more of a metric for the tool that you're using, right?
Or
but,
how shitty your code is.
Exactly. What do you think about percentage of false negatives? Because I'm seeing more and more, let's say, SAST or DAST or security tool vendors are saying, oh, we have, I don't know, very low or 0 rate of false positives. But what that actually means that they're actually missing a lot of stuff, right? Which can only be found by different tools or by manual review. And sometimes I look at the, when I'm doing a manual code review, I'm finding vulnerabilities which really puzzled me. It's like, why didn't the automated tool, why didn't it find it, right?
Now,
What do you think about false negatives?
If you remember that blue zone of SAST, there were quite a few static analysis tools that were not detecting everything by any means, only about 70% detection rates, but they had lower false positives. So you can see that trade-off being made by the static analysis tool creators, as they don't want to, they would like to catch everything, but they know if they go for it, they're going to have more false positives. Now, for me, I would always go for the tool that sees everything and gives me more noise. I don't want to miss anything. And like I said, I did mention in the talk that the act of triaging through those false positives can teach you a lot as well. And, you know, if you've got 500 defects reported and you know that only 250 of them roughly are going to be real and the rest is going to be junk, it's not the end of the world to go through that. It's not. It does take time, but it will take you on a journey through the darkest reaches of your code base. You'll really be starting to poke around. And you know, any of this kind of review, any of this kind of insight is useful, in my opinion, to go in there. Project managers and product owners may disagree, and they don't want to have their teams spending days and days dealing with false positives, but it's not all bad, really. I don't think it's an opportunity to improve code as well. So yeah, of course, you know, if you can use a tool and you can afford a tool that won't give you any false positives and will detect everything, then go with one of those.
Thanks. Looks like there was another interesting question from John.
Coding to the benchmark. Yes, coding to the benchmark. Now, this is actually part of the reason why we haven't updated our collection of benchmarks for over a year now. So I think we did, what I showed you there was probably 2020. And what happened shortly after that is one of the new static analysis tool vendors put a press release out saying that they had 100% detection and 0 false positives against the OWASP benchmark. Now, looking at the results and the performance of the tools that never acknowledged by vendors who never acknowledged the OWASP benchmark project, that doesn't seem possible for a static analysis tool. So I strongly suspected that vendor had coded in specific detections specifically for that benchmark. And unfortunately, it's just a fact of life, really. If the OWASP benchmark becomes something that we do really start to compare things against, it'll get gamed. We're back to, you know, any metric becomes a target, it's no good anymore. But we will be doing another run through. It takes quite a while to run through all the tools and get hold of them, get the latest versions, especially the commercial ones. And it'll be interesting to see how things have moved on over the last 2 years. But yeah, definitely a problem.
I think there's one last question. Do you think open source packages is the biggest source of bugs into modern applications?
It's not, and it's provably not. And the esteemed Jeff Williams, previously of OWASP, now of Contrast Security, they have a very, very good free to download study on this, because they have an IAST tool, and they get a lot of insight globally into where the security defects are. And I think the open source packages, the statistics, I'm probably not completely right on this, but I think library code comprises around 80% of the total code in any application. Only about 20% is custom code on top of that. And I think they currently are contributing about 8% of the security defects, despite being the vast majority of the code. So for whatever reason, I'm not going to theorize the quality of code in popular open source packages is better than yours, better than mine. Whether that's many eyes make all bugs shallow, all that kind of stuff, I don't know. Maybe better developers write FOSS code than typically work in a large bank. Don't know. But the quality of the code does seem to be there. Now, the issue with this statistic is it doesn't tell you about the severity of the problems caused by those defects. It's just a total number. So as we've seen very recently, when a popular open source package introduces a defect into the world, all hell breaks loose. So the impact of this 8% of all of the vulnerabilities for a FOSS package is much, much bigger. So again, statistics, damn lies, that kind of stuff. Things like this is a case where just kind of total count isn't giving you the whole story. And if you cast your mind back to that NIST study, I was presenting that to a team a few weeks ago, and one person on the team did point out something obvious that I'd missed, which was, sure, design bugs and configuration bugs are only 14 and 13%, but how severe are the design ones? How severe are the configuration ones compared to the ones caused by the code? And that's always a lens that we should be thinking about to put on that. So the big headline figures may not be telling us the whole story, but they're definitely not the biggest source of bugs. However, the bugs they do introduce are really bloody terrible. That's a very good point by Erlen there. And the IaaS tools can see this. So when you get the agent-based testing tools, they can not only tell you where you have you're using a vulnerable application, but because they've instrumented the whole thing internally, they can tell you whether you are exercising the code in the library that has the vulnerability or not, which I find very, very interesting, getting down to that level of granularity. And you're right, most FOSS libraries, most big popular packages, they have a lot of code that simply nobody ever runs.
Okay, I think that is a wrap, I want to say. Thank you very much for everyone joining. I think if you guys want to continue this conversation, reach out to Toby, because it is a very interesting conversation and very topical, I know. I've listened to it many times. But thank you very much for everyone attending, and I look forward to many more events and good speakers together.
Thank you all.